Hello, everyone. Oh, Ton, you should keep your video off until I introduce you in about 5 minutes.
Okay, sorry.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising as we focus our attention on Gaza and Israel. And this is a topic, as you all know, that has been very important to us because of the magnitude of the events that are taking place in that part of the world. I want to start, however, not with Gaza today, but with Ukraine. This week marks the third anniversary of the special military operation conducted by the Russian government into Ukraine to secure Crimea. I don't want to talk about the particulars of that war or that conflict. What I'd like to dwell on is a common denominator between what we are witnessing around Ukraine and what we are witnessing around Gaza. And I do so because it's so important for all of us to understand how the news media seeks to manipulate how we think. We approach the media when we want the news. We just want to know what's happening. But what we get when we watch the news is not what's happening. It's what the prevailing elites want us to believe about what's happening. And I want to parse this in the following way. With the advent of the Trump administration, a whole new approach is underway in terms of the war in Ukraine, more broadly, NATO's relationship to Ukraine, NATO's relationship to Russia, more fundamentally still, the United States' relationship with Russia. That was starkly implemented yesterday in the vote of the General Assembly of the United Nations, which was contemplating a resolution that last year was boilerplate to condemn the Russian invasion and the unprovoked aggression against Ukraine. And yesterday, the United States joined Russia and North Korea to vote against the resolution. And what we've seen over the last couple of weeks is a complete meltdown in Europe, in the mainstream press, in the United States, talking about how Trump has betrayed the Ukrainians, how Trump is now sort of channeling Vladimir Putin, and how Trump is sacrificing the Ukrainians for Russian aggression. First of all, nothing is further from the truth. And secondly, what is happening between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin is what routinely took place from 1945 to 1991. Whatever the tensions between the United States and Russia, then the Soviet Union, until it collapsed in 1991, virtually every president had multiple summits with the Russians. President Nixon had détente with Leonid Brezhnev. There were multiple treaties and protocols limiting the nuclear threat while the Soviet Union was still communist and the United States was still capitalist. And then something very strange happened, which I've talked about many, many times. And that is with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the neoconservatives, the neocons in the United States, gained the ascendancy for the first time and decided that even though the Soviet Union was no longer there and Russia was no longer communist, because they were dedicated to full spectrum dominance, this is important for Israel. They wanted to move NATO to the east. They wanted to break up Russia. They wanted to subordinate China. And they wanted the United States to enjoy its unipolar moment for 1,000 years. Summits basically stopped, except at meetings when various presidents would meet Vladimir Putin. And under President Biden, there were no summits at all. Because what happened was peace, normal relations became a dirty word, became something that if you talked about normalizing with Russia, if you talked about who's really responsible for the Ukraine war, you were considered a mouthpiece of Vladimir Putin, even though a rising crescendo of commentators, including Jack Matlock, the final ambassador of the United States to the Soviet Union, Jeffrey Sachs and many people, John Mersheimer, were saying that peace is possible. We just have to go back to the way it was before the breakup of the Soviet Union. And for the United States to stop thinking that it had to control the world. And as I've said before, this is what's happening with Donald Trump now. A recognition that the unipolar moment of the United States is over, that full spectrum dominance is absurdity in the face of Russia and China and the growing power of the BRICS. And yet, because Europe, the mainstream media, the political class has become so addicted to war and this notion of US supremacy that even though Trump is doing the obvious, sitting down with the Russians in Riyadh and talking about normalizing relations, getting rid of sanctions, establishing trade across a variety of key industrial areas, and bringing this war to a close. It is considered radical and controversial. That construct is what shapes our perception and the media deliveries about Israel. Israel also believes in full spectrum dominance, that the Israeli state, the Jewish people, have the right to all that land. And nobody's going to stand in their way, so that the parallelism between Zionism and neoconservatism is exactly the same mentality. It's really important for people to understand that it's that mentality that is shaping these events. So that even if you question Zionism, you question the right of Israel to have all of Palestine, you're considered anti-Semitic. I can't tell you how many times I've been charged with being anti-Semitic and that I'm a mouthpiece for Putin. By simply elevating the dialogue to a greater scope so that we can see that war is not necessary if we change the construct of what it is that we're seeking to achieve. Marco Rubio is the first Secretary of State in history to talk about multipolarity and that the unipolarity is no longer relevant in our world. And it was Donald Trump that began the process of a ceasefire in the Middle East, because I think instinctively he's seeking to calm the geostrategic and international relations by calling for a 50% reduction in the nuclear weapons and a reduction in military spending between the United States and Russia and China, which the Russians have agreed is a worthy goal, and the Chinese with more hesitation because their budgets are minuscule compared to that of the United States. So when we consider Gaza today and we consider what's going on in the Middle East, let us hold a framework that peace is possible, even though in the last 24 hours, it's been reported that 6 more babies and young children have frozen to death in Gaza. One little baby called Sham was only 6 days old because the Israelis are refusing to allow humanitarian relief in any meaningful way to come into Gaza and are doing everything they can to jeopardize the ceasefire and the peace process. And so we need to understand that this context within which we've considered foreign policy for the last 30 years now, 35 years, is beginning to break down, and many people are very uncomfortable with this emerging new reality. And part of what we need to do, in my view, is to midwife and nurture this new mentality within the context of which peace is no longer a dirty word. And normalization, whether it's between Russia and the United States, Russia and Ukraine, Russia and Europe, the Israelis and the Palestinians, that in fact, that is a desirable goal and it is achievable. So thank you everyone for joining us here on Humanity Rising. And I would like to now, in this spirit, welcome Ton van der Kroon, who's been on Humanity Rising before, who's spent a lot of time in the Middle East. He's actually a specialist in men's studies and wrote a best-selling book called The Return of the King. And he has been tireless in his support of the reconciliation process between Israelis and Palestinians, between Jews and Arabs for many, many years, because he believes that peace is actually possible if we would simply let go of our worldviews that deny it as a virtue. So, Ton, thank you for joining us here on Humanity Rising. And I want to just open it up for any comments that you would like to make on my initial remarks, and then we will move forward from there.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. Good to see you again, and good to see everybody joining here. I was struck basically by what you said, that the media gives an idea of what's happening, and then in reality it's so different. And it reminded me of the first time I went into Gaza, because that was a weird experience. I didn't know what to expect. I was actually very afraid to go there. It was in 2004, I think, that I walked first in. You have to imagine you drive through the country of Israel, and you come to this kind of how do we say it, airport sort of hall. It's called checkpoint Erez. And you go through that checkpoint. There are all kinds of checks, and they check your luggage, etc. And at the end, you exit the hall, and there's this wall, 8 meter high, and there's one little door cut out in the wall, and you go through it, and on the other side is a complete different world. At that time, there was no path or no road. I had to walk for 1 kilometer through the sand, through no man's land, to reach the outskirts of Gaza City. And there somebody waited for me to put me in a taxi, and I drove through this very gray city, very strange. It always smelled strange, like I had some years that there was no petrol, and it smelled like barbecue all the time, because they used oil, cooking oil, in their cars, which seemingly
I didn't
worked.
know that.
Yeah. And so my view of Gaza changed tremendously by being there. I had this image only from television, from the news, what we all have. And then when you come there, it's a complete different experience. One of the things that I experienced was that the people I met and I worked for a theater day productions, which was organized by a Dutchman and a Jewish American woman and a Palestinian man. I worked with these, in the beginning it was 10 actors, later became more and more and more. And of course, we looked at each other the first evening, like, who are you? And they looked at me like, what are you coming to do here for us? Like, how can you understand our situation? How can you do trauma healing with us if you don't know our war, etc.? But I think in about an evening or so, we became friends. And then I realized that over the few days that we're just the same. They were just the same men as we are, with the same issues, the same problems, the same fears. So my whole image of what I had about Islam and about Gaza completely shattered. And I just had an amazing time. And from there on, it started. Yeah. And I remember very well, there was one time a journalist from the BBC who was in my hotel, and he came to my table one morning, and he said, "Ton, did you see any casualties today? Because I still have a minute for my documentary." And I thought, wow, that is interesting. So he's looking for casualties, for trauma, for people who are really upset. But I just saw nice men, intelligent men that I worked with, and I had a lot of fun. I had a great time. So I thought, this is how we create a war, by just focusing on it all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm just reminding me, your remarks reminding me of when I was in Israel. I was in the what that was it called, the American program at the University of Tel Aviv in Middle Eastern Studies, This was in 1971, 72, and it was my junior year abroad. And I can still remember back then there was no real demarcation for either the West Bank or
Mhm.
Gaza.
Yeah,
And I remember walking all by myself from Jerusalem to Bethlehem and just wandering around the West Bank. But we didn't know it was the West Bank back in those days. And going down into Gaza, and it was basically refugees at that point. But there was no sense of Gaza, and there was
yeah,
no sense of West Bank in any meaningful way. So with you going in 2004, it's still more demarcation because it had evolved then. But still, you kind of walk through this little gate, you go through the sand, the desert, and there you are in Gaza City. And then in 2009 is when they clamped down, and essentially the concentration camp
yeah,
began.
yeah.
And but continue your story of from 2004 on. Just recount your odyssey with Gaza and with Israel and your mediations and the
Yeah.
different groups that you've done since that time.
Yeah, well, I basically worked like for 10 years in Gaza, every year coming back for a week doing trauma work with these young guys and women also later on, but I was a bit more sensitive, of course. And then after 10
So you
years,
went specifically to do trauma work.
yeah, exactly. And basically, I was flown in after wars. So the war of 2008, 2009, the war of 2014. That the whole summer they had bombardments for 50 days.
Yeah.
There were 1,300 people being killed, and I was the first one to get in. It was really strange. Even doctors were still waiting on the border, and I had already my permit because the theater had arranged it. And I walked in while all the tanks were running out. So it was a very strange experience to see all these tanks and all this military of the Israeli army going out and now with my backpack walking in. And I thought, okay, now it's my turn. My work is starting.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
worked with this company, which by then I think it was about 80 people that I worked with. And I said, okay, let's get back into the trauma as soon as possible. I want to know what happened in those 50 days. I want you to tell me because everybody closed up. No, it was like it hadn't happened. Nobody said anything. And then I asked, how is that possible? Because I've been seeing it on the news the whole summer. And so, how is this possible that you don't talk about it? And then I understood something about trauma. Everybody is silent about it because you don't want to get upset again. You don't want to get into the emotions of it. You don't want to trouble your neighbor because then your neighbor has the same sort of story. Um, So what I did was I put a talking stick in the middle and I said, tell me your stories. What happened? And I used actually a bit of a different technique first to help. I put a whole big labyrinth on the floor in the theater, and I asked them to walk into the labyrinth while I played music, uh, and I told them please go back to these 50 days and what did you experience during the 50 days? You walk into the labyrinth and you're going to experience again these 50 days. Well, and the others watched. And that was the most extraordinary thing I've ever seen. Like some people collapsed in the middle of the labyrinth, others started crying uncontrollably. Some people had to be dragged out, they couldn't get out. It was like, it was a massacre. And then afterwards, we started telling the stories, like what happened to you? And they started to open up and they say, well, this and this and this story has happened to me, and this story happened to another person. And mostly we could cry and we could laugh and we could talk about it. And that opened up the whole thing. And uh, those were profound sessions. I can't tell you that has been changing my life.
I can just imagine.
Yeah, yeah,
And for them
yeah.
to go through that kind of a therapeutic process where in a country where, therapy, psychotherapy, and it doesn't even exist.
Doesn't exist. No, no.
And who were the early adopters? Were they the young people? Were they the older men? Because you were just doing it with men at this point, right?
Men in 2014, it was men and women. It was mixed because the women said we also want to have trauma healing because we need it. So
Hmm.
I did sometimes groups separately. So I worked with the women also. But that was quite a different thing because I had to, as a man, as a Western man, I had to work with uh, 20 or 30 Muslim women. Now, that's not so common in Gaza. So what we did was we locked the door. There was somebody standing guard at the door to just to make sure that nobody knew what was happening inside. And what I did with the women was a bit the same. I put mattresses there and said, lay down. I put the most beautiful music up for an hour. And they finally could rest. Because one of the things of a war and of trauma is you get exhausted. You are so exhausted, like after so many days of fear and of trauma and of being upset. And then as women, you need to arrange the whole thing with your family and your kids, etc. So when they finally could rest for an hour with music, and I had also put some beautiful flowers in the middle, I slowly saw how they could sink into their own bodies again and rest. And I could see the tears running down. And then afterwards we talked and we said, okay, what happened to you? And then finally, I would hear the most intimate stories about their suffering and what they went through, and that is, um, yeah. I always fall a bit silent because it touched me so much that I realized later on that I got traumatized by connecting to them.
Mm.
You
Mm.
know, you become one in a certain way. You connect so deeply that you feel what they feel. And some stories are so profound. I will give you one example. Something that really touched me was from a man that always, when we did when I started the workshop, he became unconscious. He fell down for the first time for 2 hours. And I didn't know what to do with him. I thought, gee, that's not something very funny that somebody collapses and he loses his awareness.
2 hours.
And for 2 hours, and I thought, gee, I don't know how to get him out of it. And then I did something. The first year, I did something very, I don't know. At the end of the 2 hours, I slapped him in the face, said, the workshop is over. We're going to eat. And then he came back and he said, "Oh, okay." And that was my only way of doing it. Um, Later on, I got used to it when in 2014, after this war, half of the group went unconscious. Can you imagine? Of 40 people, 20 people broke down and they were out,
Just
completely
out.
out. Yeah, falling on the ground,
Whoa.
losing their consciousness. And I told the other 20 people, please hold everybody, hold the young ones, keep their hands, talk to them, and stay with them till they come back. Because I also realized at some point that the automatic system takes over, the body knows what to do. You have to trust the whole process. Otherwise, you freak out. So I was sitting there with 20 people being unconscious, and then afterwards we started talking. And for instance, one of the stories of this guy who had been unconscious most of my workshops, he started telling his story, and he said, before I entered the theater, I was a young man, and I was at home, and one of these days there was a whole big family, his own family, coming to the door. And what happened was his older brother, he had lent a car to a nephew. The car was being bombed. Nephew was killed. And they thought his older brother was a spy, a traitor. So the family wanted to get the older brother. Now the father was at home, and the older brother was already taken into custody by Hamas. And the father went with the family to the office of Hamas, and the father killed his oldest son. And 2 weeks later, he found out that his son was not a traitor. Wow. Yeah. And so this man told his story, and the only thing we could do with the whole group, we cuddled around like little monkeys, and we cried for half an hour, all of us, because we couldn't understand the depth of this trauma. And afterwards, he was out of it. He never went unconscious anymore, and he became one of the leaders of the theater. And he did an amazing job over these last 10 years in guiding other people. Yeah. So you can
That's
imagine.
extraordinary.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's extraordinary. That's a level of stress, Tom, that is way beyond, the normal stress that we in the West think we're suffering from, where we start to manifest neurotic symptoms and so forth and so on. We're like in kindergarten compared to stress
Yeah.
and trauma
Yeah.
that renders a person unconscious.
Yeah. Yeah. They just block out. The body stops functioning. And and I wasn't trained in trauma healing. I was
Yeah,
trained
I
in
can
men's work.
imagine.
I knew men's work. I had seen my parts of trauma in my groups. I could work with that. I could work basically with my own trauma. That helped. But in Gaza, it went to a complete different level. I had to work completely instinctively, just and open
Mm,
my heart
mm.
completely, just being with them, going into the depth, being there in this darkness, and then get them out. And then at the end of the day, we would laugh, and we would swim in the Mediterranean and have dinner, and we were out of it. And that was my purpose, to immediately after the hurt, after the trauma, go back into it, heal it, look at it in a different way, and realize you survived it. And then they would work with all the kids. They worked with thousands and thousands of kids in this Gaza schools, and they would go there and make these kids talk or cry or through the theater. So
Now,
that was.
was there any differentiation that you observed between the men and the women as you were engaging in this, or was it basically universal?
Well, um, one of the women once told me, Don, what you ask of us is quite difficult because, we are in a prison, in a sort of four-time prison. We are imprisoned in our dresses. We can't open up everything. We're imprisoned in our marriages. We're imprisoned in our religion and in this Gaza area. We can't get out. So how do you want us to be free and to be free thinking? Can you imagine where we are?
Mm,
Oh yeah,
mm,
right. And there I am, a Dutch guy thinking freedom is everything. And
mm.
so I had to think like them, like how is it to be completely restricted and to completely blocked in all these sorts of social ways, actually. But Yeah, underneath it all, that's the whole thing. Underneath the burqa or underneath the Islam or underneath, we're all human beings. There's no difference. So that was, I think, my big um, realization is we have to look beyond the outer appearances because that really
Yes.
blocks us and it
Yeah.
makes us make a theory or a fantasy like, oh, they will be like this or they will be like that, or Israelis are always like this, or Gaza people are always Hamas, which is Hamas is just like a little I, very small aspect of the whole Gaza.
Sure.
Yeah, it
Sure.
to me it wasn't an existence. I met them
Yeah.
once in the street. I was coming from the beach. I had been swimming. I was walking in my wet swimsuit through the town with a friend, and he said, "Oh, let's have some tea at my house." And across the street there was a group of Hamas fighters, also drinking tea. And I thought, "Oh, that's really I don't know what do I think of this. If this is so safe, especially when you're in a wet swimming trunk and completely vulnerable." Uh, and then one of these men, one of these Hamas men said, "What do you think of Gaza?" And I said, "Well, actually, I love it. I love the town. I love the work here. I truly enjoy it." And then we had a whole talk with each other. And they said, "Yeah, we guard the street and, we take care. We are the dads here, the fathers that need to take care of." And then I thought, oh, so they're also just men doing their thing
Yes.
and drinking
Yeah.
tea.
Yeah.
Um, so it taught me always to question my own beliefs and to
Yeah.
question, do I see this right or not? Or am I seeing my own movie? And an example for that was very clear. The first year I was in a taxi and I was standing in front of a red light. I had to stop. And next to the taxi came a truck full of men and they started shooting in the air. And it really freaked me out. I thought, oh shit, I shouldn't have come here. I'm right in the middle of getting into a war zone. And now they start shooting here. And the taxi driver turned around to me and he said, "Don't you really like this wedding that's happening?" And I thought, oh shit, they really get me here. Like, so
Yeah.
the fear of what I was projecting was completely not true.
Yeah. Yeah.
But of course,
Exactly.
it tricked me.
Yeah. Exactly. Exactly. Now, when were you in Gaza last?
2018, I worked then not with actors, but with a group of 30 journalists, young journalists mostly. We did 3-day trauma healing. But by that time, 2018, I also started working with Israelis. And that changed the whole story for me because
Oh, tell us. Tell us.
well, first of all, I had a good Jewish friend, older lady, who came to me and she said, "Ton, listen, you've been working for 10 years on the other side of the wall. Now you have to come to us because," and there are a few reasons. She said, "You are getting imbalanced. You're losing the perspective of both sides. And you have more Jewishness in you than you think." I'm raised Catholic. I'm from a huge Catholic family. I thought, what does she mean by that? So I was really intrigued, actually. And so the next year, I started doing my first trauma healing workshop with Israeli men, also because I wanted to know how are they in the story? What's their situation? Um, and that changed my whole relationship to Gaza because then the owner of the theater said, "Ton, I can't invite you anymore because you might be a traitor because you work for the Israelis. And if they know that you work with Israelis, it's getting too dangerous for us." because then Hamas will check on us and they say, hey, who is this guy? What is it? Why is he coming here? So that became too dangerous, and the door closed for me on Gaza.
Oh, so after that, they wouldn't let you in.
No, no, they didn't invite me anymore because it was getting. And for me, I also felt like this is getting a bit. In a war, you don't want to be seen with the enemy.
Sure, sure.
And basically, they always try to get me on their side. Both countries tried to get me on their side. And what I promised myself was when I started to work is I'm not going to take sides. I'm from Holland. It's not my war. It's not my conflict. So I'm not, and I'm coming there for healing. So I'm not going to take sides, which is extremely difficult, by the way.
Well, let's pause around the
Yeah.
Israeli. Now, you've done Palestinian men and women, then you did Israeli men.
Yeah.
What did you find out about the Israeli men that was different than the Palestinians?
Well, there's a lot of difference, except that they're all men. So again, when you look through the cultural layer, it's all the same. If I did workshops with men in Russia, in England, in Belgium, in Holland, in Israel, it's all the same stuff. So we all have issues. We all have our shadow side. We all have fear and sadness. So basically, that's very much the same. But with Israeli men, there was something peculiar. They had no clue what was happening in Gaza. It was like they didn't look at it. It was like cut off from their perspective, just like us, basically. Nobody knows what's going on in there. So that struck me because I thought, that's strange because they are your neighbor. So and you don't know anything about it. So they asked me, Ton, how is it in Gaza? So I had to tell them everything, like, well, it's this and this, and I told them all the stories, and they were like, oh, wow, wow, somebody has come out of Gaza and he's still alive and he can tell the stories, and they were so happy to hear about it. Like it was like a lost family member that they finally heard about, like, oh, so these are the people on the other side. And it made it much more human and much more normal. And then you see the framing of the media that tries to make us
Yeah.
dehumanize us all the time, which makes it so problematic, actually. And then I learned, of course, that the Israeli have a complete different history, a different story, different trauma, the trauma of the Holocaust that is still wave after wave of generations still there. The fear, there's a lot of fear I felt. Um, that was really that really struck me. For instance, I was sleeping in the kibbutz and I had to sleep in one of these safe rooms. So every house has a safe room, and that is makes the house extra or the room extra strong. And there's an enormous strong door uh, closing that room, and that really freaked me out. So, what is this? It creates so much fear to sleep in a safe room. And I had been sleeping so many times in hotels and places, and in Jericho and in Gaza, and that didn't make me afraid at all. But those safe rooms did. And I thought, that's really weird. Like, why do we create that fear? Um, and of course, you say, yeah, but it's for safety. Like now in wars, you need a safe room. Um, but psychologically, it creates the opposite.
Mm,
You
yeah,
understand
for
what
sure. Yeah. Well, let me uh, recount something that I experienced when I was at the University of Tel Aviv in the Jewish American program that I mentioned earlier. There was at some point during that year, there was a major piece in the Jerusalem Post, and it was of a psychologist that had been treating survivors, Holocaust survivors,
Mhm.
who reported dreams of crouching in a corner and then the Gestapo break through the door and stomp them with their boots and so forth and so on. And that was like a recurrent sort of nightmare for many of the Holocaust survivors. And what made the publicity and the controversy by the early 70s is he said, as he was beginning to treat the new generation, the new soldiers, many of them were reporting to him the same nightmare, but instead of crouching in the corner, they were the one knocking down the door
Uh-huh.
and stomping on the Palestinians.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so he was making the point that as a Jew, he
Yeah.
was saying there's a certain corruption of the Israeli soul that's taking place
Yeah.
because we're becoming the oppressor.
Yeah.
And that actually caused quite a stir and a debate in our Jewish American program about what it meant to be a young person in Israel. And so I'm just wondering, as you were interacting with the Israeli men and women or men, did that come up at all? Was there any sense that they had become the oppressor?
Yeah. But that was a difficult realization. Um, and but I had an incredible experience with that with a group of, I think, about 25 men who were also trainers, therapists in men's work. They said, we want to get together. Tom, can you give us a workshop? And what I normally do is I work with a mythological story. And I took the story of the Greek myth, the Minotaur and
Oh,
and and Icarus and Daedalus. And so the story is that Daedalus creates this labyrinth, and in the middle of the labyrinth is the Minotaur. He's a monster. He kills babies and kids and children. And so the hero, Theseus, has to come in, or is it Perseus? I don't really know. The hero
Theseus.
comes.
Oh, Theseus, yeah.
Yeah. He comes in. He has to kill the monster, basically it. So I told them the whole story. And I said, you have 24 hours with your group, and your task is kill the monster. Okay. So they went into it, they went into the story, they took roles, they started talking about it. And at, I think, about 2 o'clock in the night, they sat around the fire. They were completely upset and angry. Somebody had left already the workshop. He said, what an awful workshop this is. And they said, how is it possible, Ton? You have the most advanced men here, the most spiritual men, and look at us. We're fighting, we're angry, we're upset. We just don't know what you want from us. What is this story? What is this task of killing the monster? And then an older Israeli took the talking stick and he said, I think you understand. I think the monster is in us.
Mm.
It's our fear. And right that night, there was again attacks in Gaza, and they started to understand we are attacking the monster of Hamas, but it's mirroring our own fear. That's what we're fighting. And that struck so deep in that group, like, oh my God, we're looking in the mirror here. The other is the mirror of us, but we can't
Mhm.
see it. And
Mhm.
that completely changed the whole group because they start to realize that, yeah, the monster that we're fighting is our own monster.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I
Exactly.
think that
Yeah, yeah.
realization is profound. Uh,
Yeah.
because I think that's what wars do. You have an image of the enemy, and you project all your negativity, all your fears, and all your anger and upset and your trauma. You project that on the enemy, and you don't see anymore that they're normal people. That they project that also on you, so you are
Mhm.
the enemy for them.
Yeah,
Uh,
exactly.
and there you
Both
go.
sides are doing it.
Yeah, and you make whole theories about it, like
Yeah.
political theories or economical theories or whatever theories. You start to fantasize about the other, but you're completely out of touch with reality
Mm, mm, mm.
and out of touch with yourself. So you be then what I saw for most Israelis these days is really traumatic in that they lost their ethics and their morality. They thought always we are the good guys. We are the good guys fighting evil. And
Yeah.
slowly they start to realize, well, we don't know anymore who's the right one and the good one, or they cling to it so desperately, like no, 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 we are the good ones. But at some point, the soldiers who went into Gaza the last year, they have seen, of course, traumatic things, and they've done traumatic things, and they come back into their civilization, and they start to question,
Yeah. Yeah.
and they
Yeah.
start to commit suicide.
Mhm.
Because that's what happens. You come out of the war, but you can't get the war out of you. And you can't go back to your family in a normal way. And you're heavily traumatized by
Mhm.
being a perpetrator.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Well,
So,
let's fast forward to October 7th and the reality that, when you were doing your thing as this innocent, idealistic, men's worker and drama guy, and you wander into Gaza, and then all of a sudden it's far more real than you can imagine, including you not being invited back because you're consulting with the enemy.
yeah,
And then
yeah,
all of a sudden, October 7th happens,
yeah,
and concerted state policy toward the elimination of 2 million people
yeah,
begins to take shape
yeah,
that has left the entire country. Well, it's only 5 miles by 25 miles, the entire prison camp,
yeah,
completely traumatized because everybody's been moved multiple times.
yeah,
Everybody's been living under the threat of bombardment 24/7 for since October 7th, 2023. And the ceasefire is barely holding. Based on what you were doing sort of at an individual level, how would you understand? I mean, if 50% of the people were going unconscious after just what happened in 2008, 20, I would almost predict that if you went back into Gaza now, virtually everybody would go unconscious.
yeah. Yeah, I'm afraid so too. It for me, it wiped off the map all the work we had done on both
Yeah.
sides. I think everybody was traumatized. All the peace workers, all the therapists on both sides were thinking like, oh gosh, this sets us back to the Stone Age, basically,
Mhm.
literally, because there's only stone in Gaza left. It I had many, many dark nights in the beginning of the war because I didn't know if anybody of the people and the friends I have would survive. The fear that they would be killed, that you wake up and that you get a message or this person has been killed, or um, that was really heavy and difficult. And there was one moment that I tried to look on Google Maps. I tried to find my hotel and my theater, and I couldn't find it. I couldn't find it anymore. It was gone. And even the street was gone. I couldn't even recognize the street. And that is something I don't know on a very deep level. I think that people that went back to the north about a couple of weeks ago, after the ceasefire, people from Gaza City, they walked back from their camps towards the house, And I read a report of a woman. She said, I couldn't find my street anymore. The whole town has been erased from the map of the earth. That is something beyond my uh, comprehension. I've never experienced something like that. Like a whole city of 1.5 million people is gone. Um, yeah, it makes me very silent inside. Like, wow, that is trauma to the max. Um,
What, how, if you were going back to Gaza now, let's just say you were invited back,
hmm,
how would you even begin to approach the therapeutic pathway that people need to
hmm.
take? I mean, how would you think about it?
That's funny. I thought of it a lot, although I won't be able to go back probably. I wouldn't know how to get in. Um, but my thought was I would take a backpack full of coffee and start with making coffee and sit down and talk with them. And because you have to start with a very basic, you have to leave all your theories, and that's what happened again and again.
Mm,
Leave all your
mm,
theories of what would happen or how we, and just to be there with them on their level. And I thought my feeling was like, oh, I would love to make some Arab coffee and then talk. And how are you at the moment? Because there's no room to work, there's no sound system, there's no theater anymore, there's only beach or there's rubble or so what do you do? I have no clue. But just I think that's what I learned with trauma healing is just being with people in their situation
mm,
is the most important.
mm, mm. Yeah.
Recognizing, acknowledging where they are. And it's the same on the other side, acknowledging the Israeli men and women where they are. They are also in a very traumatic situation. Their fears have become like the worst, like they would be wiped off the earth also. So they're also in a terrible state of being. And I think that's always the best place to start with the other person. Like, okay, what's happening to you?
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, with just some Arab coffee.
Some air coffee. I think I would start with that. Yeah,
Don't forget to take the sugar. It always tastes better with
exactly.
lots of sugar.
Exactly. They haven't tasted it for months. They haven't tasted sugar or coffee for months.
Yeah,
So to give them a sip back of what life
yeah,
was
yeah,
before,
yeah, yeah.
and those kind of simple things. Yeah.
And then going back to the Israeli side,
Yeah.
the data is that the overwhelming majority of the Israeli public has actively supported the genocide.
Yeah.
And there have been, as you say, an increasing number of soldiers that have deserted, that have refused duty, that have committed suicide, etc. But that's a kind of a minuscule
Yeah.
amount against a whole nation that has shut its psyche down to legitimate this full spectrum dominance
Yeah.
that still grips the Israeli mind. You can feel it starting to be surrendered here in the United States. And as I indicated, Trump, I think, is that transitional president that is realizing that that mentality no longer serves. But in Israel, it seems to be getting stronger and stronger.
Well,
So,
and
what would be your
unfortunately,
comment on that?
unfortunately, that's completely supported by Trump and also by Biden. But Trump,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah, he supports the Israeli government full speed. And luckily, I know some Israelis who are still holding their place in the middle. and keep their hearts open, which is really, I find it tremendous what they're doing, the courage they have. I have one friend who was in one of the kibbutzes, kibbutz Be'eri, that got invaded by Hamas, and he had been going to the safe room under his house. And when he came up, when his whole house was burned down, and 80 people of his kibbutz were killed. Um, I spoke to him a couple of months into the war, and he was walking on the beach, and he said, "Ton, I'm still there in the middle. I still love my neighbors in Gaza. I still are standing in between these two people. They're my people, and the Israelis are my people, and I keep my heart sane." And I said, "Thank you so much for that." Because that's when you can work, and you, of course, you have your story on your side and you have stories on the other side, but can you stay human? Or are
Mm.
you, I also lost a couple of Israeli friends who said, "Don, you know, sorry to mention the word, but fuck you with your peace stories. We don't want to hear the word peace anymore. We just want to root out Hamas, and then we talk. First, we have to kill everybody on the other side because that's not going to work here." And then, so I lost some dear friends who I said, "Well, I appreciate you, but let's talk after a few years, and then we'll see." Um, so yeah, it's also been difficult, but luckily enough, and what you say is true there. It's just a small percentage of people who are still opening up to the enemy,
Yeah,
and the
yeah.
most people are. It was already created for years by the Netanyahu government. This
Mm.
div this hatred, this complete working up towards an event, and then you can brutally smash them down. It it feels like almost like a setup. Like, okay, this is
Yeah,
what we want the whole country. Let's hope there will be some event, and then we
yeah,
can step in.
yeah, exactly, exactly.
Yeah.
Now, Ton, I'd be interested as we start to bring this to a close about your own interior journey. Because, not very many people in the West have been exposed to the level of trauma that you have, particularly seeking to ameliorate the trauma. I've never been with someone that's so stressed they go unconscious.
Hmm.
That would be a kind of, I would say that would be a shocking experience for me,
Yeah.
right? And like most of us, we've seen trauma in our time. We've read about it in the newspapers, and we're kind of shocked about it when we see it on the news. You've experienced it up close and personal, as they say.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I would just love to hear how you've grown. How's that contributed to your own spiritual growth and development? How are you different now than you were before you started?
Wow, there are several sides to that, but I started to appreciate and to be incredibly thankful for being able to be so close to that darkness, to understand that there is in this world there's this deep darkness, and it kind of nourished me, it made me more humble, it made me more understanding. And I know there's a spiritual perspective that people say, no, you need to focus on the good thing and you need to raise your frequency and stay positive and loving and la da da. And I went into the opposite direction. I said, no, no, to find your humanity, to rise humanity, um, you need to understand the depth of it, the core
Mm,
of being human, a core of being of suffering, because in the depth of this suffering, I found tremendous joy and love, a love that I can't express. It's like overwhelming. It's beyond that pain. There is a love beyond death. And
mm. Say more about that. Say more. Say
Yeah,
more.
it really gave me such a deep understanding of life and of the soul,
Mm.
uh, that it made me so rich. But the problem was also it made me more lonely because each year when I came out of Gaza, nobody wanted to hear the story because they said, "Oh, no, that's too far out. That's far away, and it's always Gaza. We see it on news. We see it on the television. That's enough. We don't want to know."
Hmm. Hmm.
And I thought, but you have to know because this is a powerful story. This is a power that will be known to the world at some point. We will have to deal with it because we try to lock it up into this little piece of land and we build a wall around it and then we think we're safe. No, that's not how it works. You can't push down your shadow and think that we will be safe. You have to go towards the shadow. You have to walk towards it. Look it in the face, and then it smiles back at you and it says, "No, I'm actually just okay here."
Mm.
So
Mm.
it taught me a lot about the spiritual path, that it has its depth and its darkness. And through that darkness, you come to a deep, yeah, love for humanity. Yeah, that's what it brought to me. It created a deep love for Israeli people, for a deep love for Arab people, and one time I have felt like I need two hearts. I love this story and I love that story. And I don't know how to connect them because it seems impossible, but it
Yeah.
brings you to a deeper understanding.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you've been blessed with what Plato calls the enlargement of the soul.
Something like, yeah, exactly.
So
Yeah.
your soul is so big you can now hold two hearts.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
quite a accomplishment, my friend.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh,
And in the end, I think this whole work was for me. You know, that's
yeah,
always the double bind in all this therapeutic work. You do it for other people, and you do it for da 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 da, and in the end, you realize no, it's only for my own development that I am opening up to something deeper,
yeah, yeah,
understand my own trauma and my own issues and my own shadow side.
yeah, exactly, exactly. You know, you love your neighbor as yourself. You understand your own suffering as you empathize with the suffering of others. And the more you can give, the more you can receive.
Yeah.
And you exemplify that in a very, very powerful way. This really
Yeah.
extraordinary, extraordinary.
And
Uh,
mostly what we try to do with trauma and or wars, we try to analyze it. We try to make a story of it. We try to understand it
yes.
mentally. But that's not where the solution is because this creates more and more. It's like a labyrinth in itself. You never get out of it. So you have to go deeper. You have to go to the heart of it.
Mhm.
And by loving the complexity, by loving what is happening, that's where you get out.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Ton, thank you. What a powerful story that you've shared with us. It's leaving me feeling both deeply sad at the magnitude of human suffering, but also expanded. I feel like I think we've all been expanded by just the way you've been able to contain these contradictions and these opposites and hold both in perfect equilibrium
Mm,
within the embrace of love. That's an extraordinary capacity, and I think worthy of emulation by us
mm,
all, because we're in a world where we're always being taught the other guy's wrong
yeah,
and you're right. So
yeah.
you're holding the contradictions in a very, very powerful way. So I just want to acknowledge and honor that.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you.
So that'll bring us to a close for today, everyone. You can join Ton in the after chat if you'd like to talk with him more informally and intimately. But this has been important, everybody, because what Ton exemplifies is, I think, a depth of humanity that has been eroded over the last several decades by all the forces of our modernity. And we've been pushed more and more into our heads.
Yeah, exactly.
And what's required is the journey back to our hearts, because that's where we find our humanity. And Ton has been a teacher for us today. So thank you, Ton. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.